Hi, I'm Joe Feeks, editor of Pig Health Today, and with me is Dr. Amber Stricker. She is a veterinarian for the Suiday Health and Production Vet Clinic in Algona, Iowa. Amber, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've been very active in what is known as the Common Swine Industry Audit. It was introduced a few years ago. For the benefit of all our viewers, tell us exactly what that is and its overarching goals.
Yeah, so the Common Swine Industry Audit was developed in response to, there was all these packer audits that were coming out, and they all had different standards that they were requiring of the producer. And many of my producers sold to multiple packers, and so they were having to comply with two or more different set of standards, and it was becoming really redundant, and a lot of work and effort was going into trying to comply with all of them. And then on top of that, they'd get audited by maybe one packer, and then a month later they'd get audited by another packer, and there was just a lot of redundancy there. And so the way I understand it, the industry came together with the pork board and decided, let's just try to all agree on one common platform and get rid of all the redundancy and stuff and make it less burdensome to the producer. And that's where the Common Swine Industry Audit came about.
I would think that'd be difficult to do, though, because all meat companies have different standards in the way they want to market things. I would think that they would still have some particular things that they would want to have audited.
It's more industry-wide standard on animal welfare and food safety was the focus of the original packer audits and PQA+, and they just kind of came together and said, let's set standards we can all agree on, and they were all pretty close in the first place. Yeah. But this just, so we can all agree to them, and then we have something we can roll out to the producer where regardless of the size of your operation, it's the same standards.
And is this something that is voluntary for producers, or do they pretty much have to participate if they want to sell pigs?
Yeah, so it is voluntary, but it's not, because at the same time, like you said, the privilege to be able to sell to the packer requires that they comply with the Common Swine Industry Audit. And so it's voluntary, but like I said, if you want to sell your pigs, you're going to have to comply.
Now, conceptually, it sounds great because now we're talking about one audit instead of several, but human nature, people don't like to be audited. What do you find on the farm? Are you getting a lot of cooperation, or are you getting some pushback in some areas?
I'd say both. I mean, there's an understanding by the producers that this is necessary, and that this is what the customer is asking for, is more transparency and accountability. But at the same time, these are people who take a lot of pride in what they do, and the majority of them are doing a really nice job. And it's difficult for them to let somebody into their farm and to let their guard down, to let somebody come in and critique them. I mean, these are producers who are self-employed, not used to having a lot of oversight, or a lot of people coming in and telling them, they may see a veterinarian a couple times a year, but other than that, it's them. And so I get a little bit of pushback on defensiveness or fear of what could happen if I don't, something doesn't go right, and so.
So, and what sort of things are they looking for when they conduct these audits, and what would make a farmer get defensive?
Yeah, so the big things that would be critical areas on the audit would be anything having to do with animal welfare. And so there's 5 critical components to the audit that would cause an automatic failure. And it's timely euthanasia, and then it would be the method of euthanasia, whether or not they're checking for insensibility and death. If there are willful acts of abuse occurring during the audit. So those big things are not worries, because majority of producers are doing that really well. The concern is, what if they see a scratch on a pig and I didn't think it was anything to be concerned about, and they, for some reason, it's really more fear of what could be the consequence for something if I'm not keeping records, or if something's not going right. And like I said, it can create some defensiveness on if they're taking care of the barn and someone comes in and says, you're not doing this right or that right. The tendency, human nature, is to be a little defensive.
And who is actually conducting the audits?
The third-party audits would be done by companies such as Validus. They're PACO certified. They go through a process so that the auditors are, as standardized as possible the way they approach the audit. The other side of it is the assessment, which is like the PQA+ assessment mirrors the Common Swine Industry Audit, and that's what I do. And so I go in and do the assessment, And that is a little bit different approach because I can teach, I can coach, it's kind of a safe place for the producer and myself to look and openly talk about what can we do to fix this or that. And so those are a lot easier. The auditing part is where, I think more of the concern and the angst comes from.
So tell me more about your role. Do you get in there after the auditor has been there? The producer will call you up and say, well, I failed this part and that part, and I need to talk with you about it. Or do you work with them kind of proactively ahead of time to get them ready for these audits? And most importantly, just to make sure that the pigs are getting the best care as possible.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways that I would be asked to come on farm to do the assessment. And one of them would be if the packer calls up and says the site assessment is expired and it needs to be renewed. And in that case, I'd go in and under the guise of doing the PQA plus site assessment, I would administer that. And the site assessment is, the mirror image of the Common Swine Industry audit. So that would be one, just routinely every 3 years, you go in there and you renew the site assessment. And the other reason would be if they do get notified from their packer, typically my producers or my clients will call me ahead of that and they'll say, can you come out and do like a run through with me and just make sure everything looks good before the auditor gets here. Yeah. Once in a while, they'll ask me to actually be present during the audit just as a support more than anything. They just want somebody there that can help them answer questions and stuff if there's a question that arises.
So what can producers do on a day-to-day basis to make sure these audits go well?
Yeah, so on day-to-day, I always tell producers that, just pick a couple things and work on making those things improvements. So if the biggest issue is SOPs and documentation. And so I tell them, the welfare side of it, the pigs in the barn and everything comes first. But then after that, if you can make improvements, like maybe this year you focus on keeping really complete medication and treatment records and making sure you're doing daily observations. And then in a few months or something after that becomes more routine, you add something else. But I just tell producers, work on trying to get better. And if you're not there today, it's not a huge deal. It's if we're trying to make effort towards getting where we need to be.
And you were saying that before that, like there might be a situation where the packers will call and say, well, this person's audit period has expired.
Right.
Is that the correct terminology?
Yeah.
But are there other cases where the packer might call and maybe they're not liking what they see on some of the carcasses, and might that spur an audit?
Yeah, so one of the ways that they could spur an audit would be if they had like a residue question. So if for some reason a lot of pigs that they sold came back with a residue, then antibiotic residue, then they would get notification, and typically those would be like FDA audits. And so you'd have an FDA auditor come on farm and look through the medication and treatment records and things like that. And I tell my producers that's another reason why keeping records is important. It's not just because someone says, it's necessary to sell to a packer, but because it's your insurance policy for the FDA.
And the audits keep on coming. I mean, you've got the veterinary feed directive rules, and I know the FDA inspectors are going to be spending more time out in the field too. Is there a way to consolidate these audits even more?
Yeah, I don't know if there is. I mean, we are in a world of auditing. In fact, we've hired someone, on our production team at Suiday to do nothing more than audit. And he does biosecurity audits and feed mill audits and air filtration audits and welfare audits. And so there is some redundancy that I don't think you're going to get away from, but I do think it's good to see the industry moving towards a common audit on welfare and food safety.
One last question. You talked about preparing producers for audits and doing a walkthrough and saying, well, they might look at this and they might look at that. What kind of conversations do you have with your producers about their temperament during the audit?
Yeah, I tell them that, if you're doing a good job, there's nothing to worry about, and to look at it more as a way to showcase what you do every day. I mean, they care for the animals, it's their livelihood. They don't want to intentionally do anything that's not in the best interest of the animal. And so I tell them, your intentions are good, and go into it thinking I'm going to show off and showcase my farm and the good job that I'm doing every day, and don't be defensive, and be prepared so that it goes well and you don't sit there and have to fumble for records and things. You have everything ready and prepared in the audit, and it'll go a lot smoother.